Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the history and geography of Comoros. Let me grab my pencil so I can point out these little islands to you, because as you can see, they are islands. These islands are a part of Africa. They are in the Mozambique Channel, in like the very north of it. So the closest country they are to is Madagascar, but the closest country there to in mainland Africa would be Mozambique. And there's a little spoiler here, but if you ask someone from Comoros how many main islands there are, they will tell you 1, 2, 3, 4. Anywhere else in the world will tell you 1, 2, 3. So let's start off down here in Mayotte. Mayotte is a department of France, and you'll find out why and how in its history. So I'm not really going to talk about it in its geography today, just note that this is here, and it's a part of Comoros' history. Let's talk about these 3 islands. So the first island we see right here is Gazija, the largest island. The capital city of Moroni is located on this island. And all of the islands in Comoros and Mayotte are volcanic islands, and this one's definitely the most volcanic. It's covered in a bunch of extinct volcanoes, and it has one big active one. You can see it pointed out right there. It's the highest point in all of Comoros. This is Mount Karthala. It's one of the most active volcanoes in the world. Its last major eruption was in 2005, and it used to have a lake in its caldera, and after its eruption it like decimated its lake, and it has no water in it today. That's how big of a boom it had. Next we have Moali, or Moheli, I forgot to say. They have French names and Comorosian names. So Gazija, I don't know why I have such a hard time saying Gazija. I think that J is throwing me off. Anywhere else I read had it as a G. I've heard it pronounced Gazija. Gazija. I don't know why. Anyway, Gazija. In French is Clan Comore. So next we have Moali, or Moheli in French. It's the least developed of all the islands, so it's very, very green, very forested, and it has a really beautiful marine park located in it with beautiful coral and, you know, all the bells and whistles of beautiful marine life. There's also a bunch of tiny little islands. You can see them right there. But they're very, very, very tiny, but they're part of the island. And over here is Zawani, or in French is Anjouan. This one is also really, really mountainous. It has a big mountain chain there, big mountain chain here, big mountain chain there, and a bunch of mountains in the middle. Very, very, very mountainous. It also has a bunch of little islets and sandbars and little tiny islands around it. But yeah, they're way too small to point out here. And also Comoros has other islands that they claim, mainly like just off of like over here. But they are teeny tiny islands, and one of them is actually mostly like 99.9% submerged, and it's just a little sandbar sticking out of the water out in the middle of the ocean. So since they're not even in this book, they're not really worth mentioning today, but just know that there are other islands that Comoros claims. But the 2 facts that I find the most interesting personally about Comoros is that they are the #1 exporter, producer of ylang ylang, which if you know your essential oils, you know about ylang ylang. It smells wonderful. Also, this is where the coelacanth was rediscovered. So if you haven't played Animal Crossing, coelacanth are the big prehistoric deep water fish, and they look like deep water fish. Like, you know, you've seen like anglerfish and all that. They have like a very distinct, like creepy, ancient look about them. Coelacanth has that, but they're very big and ugly and weird and fascinating, I think. But they were presumed to have been extinct like during dinosaur times. Like there had only been fossils of it found until I want to say the 1970s, when one was found off the coast of Comoros. And since then, about 88 other coelacanths have been spotted, so they're alive and well in the Indian Ocean, swimming around there since dinosaur times. I think that's neat. I think coelacanth in general are neat. I want to say it was like maybe 4 or 5 months from me filming this, there was one spotted off of here. I got a news notification about it because of Animal Crossing. You can fish them in the game, but anyway. Comoros. Let's talk about its history. So, the first inhabitants of Comoros was most likely the Austronesians from Southeast Asia. They explored this whole chunk of the Indian Ocean. They lived on Madagascar as well. But many, many other cultures came. The Austronesians came around the 8th century CE. And then people from mainland mainland Africa came over. People from Asia came too, from the Malay Peninsula. They came from Madagascar. And also people came from the Persian Gulf area and the Arabian Peninsula, just a hop, skip, and a jump north from here. And that's because the Arabs at the time really heavily traded with the African peoples along the eastern coast. And apparently a few of them settled on the island. So, yeah, the towns that were set up here really flourished between like the 9th and 11th and 15th centuries. That's what it is. Trade was really strong. You know, Comoros doesn't have a lot of natural resources, so they had to trade for a lot of other goods that the islands couldn't provide them. They traded with the Arabs. They traded with what's known as the Swahili coast, like the southeastern coast of Africa. Basically, whoever would come by, they would trade with, but it was mostly the Africans and the Arabs. And as the Arabs did during this time in history, whenever they met a new culture and started a trade exchange, they brought Islam with them. And Islam really hit it off here in the Comoros. Mosques were built, all that good stuff when Islam comes to a new country and fits well with the people who live there. So, in 1503, the Portuguese arrived, the first Europeans to land on Comoros. It was most likely Vasco da Gama's fleet that first found the islands, but the Portuguese did not colonize these islands. They did trade. It's just what they're good at, apparently. They traded with the Portuguese at Mozambique, but didn't settle. And from what I could tell in my research, that's because these people were not just like living in stick huts, you know, banging rocks together to make fire. They were fully developed towns and cities, basically. You know, with their they had Islam, they had sultans, they had, you know, they were a fully functioning society on these islands, including Mayotte at this point in its history. So it's kind of hard to colonize a culture that's very firmly established. I talk about that in my video on Somalia as well. So they did trade with the Portuguese. They also traded with the English. The English would stop by on their way to Africa. You know, it's an arduous journey around Africa. So they would stop here to resupply their ships, and they would also buy slaves off of Comoros. So just as a side note, maybe I'll transition to the next part, but Comoros was constantly used for slaves. You know, the Europeans used slaves. A lot of African cultures used slaves. Slaves were in demand. So a lot of people would come to Comoros because, like I said, there's not a lot of resources, but they had people, so they would sell people. It's really sad. But that came to their detriment when the Malagasy decided that they needed more slaves. So if you haven't seen my Madagascar video, the island was made up of a lot of different like kingdoms, basically. The one we're going to talk about in this video is the Sakalava. They started coming to the islands and would raid for slaves, like burn down villages, destroy crops, kidnap people, you know, destroy entire communities, raiding for slaves. Very, very sad. And eventually they would kind of like lay claim to, especially Mayotte, but also these islands as well. This island had the most different sultanates, basically like little kingdoms on it. So from what I could tell in my research, I could be wrong, but from what I saw, it wasn't hit as hard by the Malagasy, but definitely Wally and Mayotte were definitely hit hard. So the French were, how do I put this, dealing with Madagascar in that they were planning an invasion eventually, but Madagascar is also a country that was very heavily developed social-wise when the Europeans arrived, so it's kind of hard to take over a country that's already basically a country. So the French were toying with Madagascar and negotiating the eventual goal of taking over, which they would do. But at this point, they were still toying around. So in 1841, when Madagascar and France were, well, I should say the Sakalava of Madagascar. Remember, that's what we're talking about when we say Madagascar or Malagasy in this video. Not always. They were signing a treaty with the French just to like negotiate land and all of that. And they wound up giving Mayotte to France because, like I said, they'd basically raided it. So they considered it theirs. They gave it to France. Over time, the other sultans on the other islands would wind up giving the French power in exchange for protection. Actually, it was 1886 when on Wally and Gazicha, they both signed over protection to France. And let's see, it was 1908 when all of the islands were officially placed under French protection. And they were controlled by the Governor General of Madagascar, because by that time the French had taken over Madagascar. In 1909 was when the last sultan surrendered to France, and in 1912, Comoros officially became a province of Madagascar. Fast forward to 1973, post World War II and all of that, the people of Comoros negotiated with France for independence. So they held a referendum in 1974. This island voted for independence, this island voted for independence, this island voted for independence, and this one didn't. They voted to remain with France. So Comoros officially rejects the results of the referendum, even though they held like 4 over these years. They still consider Mayotte part of Comoros, but literally nobody else does. So Comoros declared independence on July 6, 1974, and it's been a rocky road ever since. They've had in their history over 20 coups and coup attempts. Their very first coup, successful coup, well, and attempted, but it was their first coup was successful. The first coup happened literally months after the first president took office. His name was Ahmed Abdallah. Remember that in a minute. He was overthrown, and the person that overthrew him was overthrown in a coup. He actually was killed as he was trying to flee the country. And then the first president, Ahmed Abdallah, in working with Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and South Africa and France even, overthrew the third leader and retained power. And it was around this time that Comoros really became like a military dictatorship and a very strict Sharia Islamic ran country. And I mean, this led to a lot of people in the military gaining power and staging coups and attempting coups. Ahmed Abdallah was actually killed while in his office. It's debated about how he was killed and by whom, but nevertheless, I don't mean like during term, I mean like literally in his office he was murdered and someone replaced him. A lot of these coups, including that one, was led by a man named Bob Denard, or Robert Denard. He was a French military commander who kept trying to pop in and assert power. He's since been evacuated from the island by the French and placed under protection, but yeah, he was the orchestrator for a lot of them. So anyway, in 1997, Zwane and Wally both declared independence because I'm not going to go over every single little coup, but there were, like I said, there were over 20 attempts and successful coups. So these islands were like, enough is enough. We want to be not just independent, but we want to be part of France again. And France said no. France did not want them. This led to a lot of outrage and rebellion against the soldiers there. It led to another coup because the politicians weren't happy about how that was ran, so they forced the president out of office because of it, forced him to resign, basically. You know, it was very messy. So in 2001, enough was enough, and like basically everyone in the government sat down and seriously thought about how to make this country work instead of just letting it run itself into the ground or into the ocean, I guess. So they changed the constitution, they restructured a lot. Basically, they changed everything to make it more like a democracy and less like a dictatorship. And one really interesting thing that they planned was that, including today, there is a president of each island, and they have their own like parliament and governors, mayors. They're basically ran like three little independent countries, and then they have a union president that rules over all of them together. And the union president has to come from a different island each time. So if the last president came from Gazija, the next president has to come from Wali. And I think the next president coming up, they just had an election last year. But anyway, I'll get to that. The next president, I think it's Solani. I didn't write it down. Anyway. So they plotted all this out. It took a while to get it in place, but in 2006, Comoros had its very first peaceful transition of power, and it officially became a democracy at that point. And from a democratic standpoint, things have been going very, very well for Comoros. There are only two hiccups. One was that, like I said, there was a president of each island, and in 2007, each president has 1 5-year term. So in 2007, the president of Zhuani decided that he wasn't going to relinquish power, and African Union soldiers stepped in to oust him from office, and he wound up fleeing on a speedboat and now lives in political exile. But yeah, it was like Comoros is very determined to not let things like that happen again in its government. The only tiny little other thing that's happened is that the current president changed the constitution so that the union president can serve 2 terms, which is a little bit worrisome, because usually whenever a president changes the number of terms they have, it means that they could most likely add a 3rd term or a 4th term, and then election fraud and, just magically getting like 90% of the vote when only 5% of the country voted and things like that. So it's a little worrisome, but I mean, a 5-year term, 1 5-year term it's not that it's short, it's that it's a lot for, one administration to step in and do their business and then have a whole new administration just 5 years later, in my opinion at least. So as long as the democratic process stays smooth, it should be fine in Comoros. So politically, like I said, things are fine. Comoros is still very highly densely populated. They don't have a lot of people, but they don't have a lot of land. So there's not very many, like a lot of space for people to live. They're still pretty impoverished. All of those decades of political turmoil did not do Comoros well. But from what I can tell, they are slowly but surely getting better in terms of employment and food scarcity, things like that. So fingers crossed that, everything goes well for Comoros, because it really looks like it is. And as long as nothing else happens, as long as someone doesn't completely explode and destroy the island, it should be fine. So that's where I'll leave you for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. It's a tiny island. There's my big